A runaway goat barges into a school presentation, creating chaos. But what the students do next leaves the entire town amazed. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning started like any other at Jefferson High School. Mr. Johnson's science classroom, with its worn-out periodic table poster and the lingering smell of yesterday's chemistry experiments, was filled with the usual teenage indifference. 28 students sat at their desks, most of them fighting the urge to check their phones hidden beneath their tables. Mr. Johnson stood at the front of the class, his enthusiasm seemingly wasted on his distracted audience. His chalk scraped against the blackboard as he wrote Introduction to Cellular Biology in his characteristic neat handwriting. The clock on the wall showed 8:15 a.m., and the autumn sun streamed through the windows, creating perfect conditions for the students' mid-morning drowsiness. In the front row, Emily Matthews hunched over her notebook, her long brown hair partially hiding her face as she concentrated on taking detailed notes. Her pen moved quickly across the paper, trying to capture every word Mr. Johnson said about cell membranes and organelles. Unlike her classmates, Emily took her studies seriously, perhaps too seriously, as her lack of social interaction suggested. Behind her, Ryan Thompson kept shifting in his seat, his restless energy apparent in every movement. He leaned forward, his breath tickling Emily's ear as he whispered, "Hey, Em, want to hear a biology joke?" Without waiting for her response, he continued, "What did the cell say when his sister stepped on his foot?" "Mitosis." He grinned, expecting at least a slight reaction. Emily tried to ignore him, but her pen stopped moving for a brief moment. Ryan had been trying to get her to loosen up since freshman year, and while she appreciated his efforts, she preferred to maintain her focus. Mr. Johnson's voice droned on about phospholipid bilayers, competing with the subtle buzz of phones, receiving messages, and the occasional whispered conversation. The mundane morning atmosphere shattered when the classroom door burst open with a bang. Students' heads snapped up from their phones, and Mr. Johnson's chalk stopped mid-sentence. In the doorway stood a medium-sized goat, its white and brown coat gleaming in the fluorescent lights. The animal's hooves clicked against the linoleum floor as it confidently trotted into the classroom. Chaos erupted instantly. Jessica Martinez, who had been secretly applying nail polish, knocked over her bottle, creating a pink puddle on the floor. Marcus Chun, usually quiet and reserved, let out a startled yelp and nearly fell out of his chair. The back row of students scrambled onto their desks, while others pushed their chairs away, creating a cacophony of scraping sounds and nervous laughter. Mr. Johnson, his face cycling through various shades of red, attempted to maintain order. "Everyone, please remain calm," he shouted, but his voice was lost in the commotion. The goat, seemingly enjoying the pandemonium it had created, began exploring the classroom with curious headbutts to backpacks and furniture. Emily found herself frozen in her seat, her notebook forgotten as she watched the scene unfold. For the first time in her academic career, the strict structure she relied on had completely dissolved. The goat approached her desk, its yellow eyes meeting hers with what seemed like mischievous intelligence. Behind her, Ryan's laughter rang out above the general chaos, genuine and uncontrolled. The classroom had transformed from a place of structured learning into something entirely different. Papers flew through the air as the goat knocked over a stack of worksheets, and students continued to shuffle around, some trying to capture the moment on their phones, others seeking higher ground on desks and windowsills. Mr. Johnson's attempts to restore order became increasingly desperate as he tried to corner the animal while maintaining some semblance of professional composure. No one in the classroom could have predicted how this unexpected visitor would become the catalyst for something much bigger than a simple disruption of their morning routine. In the midst of the chaos, Ryan's mind was already racing with possibilities. While others saw disaster, he recognized potential. Sliding off his desk where he'd taken refuge, he made his way to Emily, who remained frozen in her seat, watching the goat with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Hey, Ryan said, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Remember that presentation we're supposed to give next week about adaptability in nature?" He gestured toward the goat, which was now contentedly chewing on someone's homework assignment. I'd say we just got ourselves a pretty amazing live demonstration. Emily blinked, her initial shock giving way to understanding. The gears in her analytical mind began turning. Their assigned presentation on environmental adaptation had been weighing on her for weeks. She'd already prepared a detailed PowerPoint about Darwin's finches. But this was something entirely different. Think about it, Ryan continued, ducking as the goat trotted past them. Instead of another boring slideshow, we could turn this whole situation into our project. I mean, what better way to demonstrate adaptation than showing how we adapted to a goat crashing our biology class? The classroom remained in disarray. Mr. Johnson had given up on maintaining order and was now on his phone, presumably calling for assistance. Several students had formed a loose circle around the goat, taking videos and posting them to social media. The animal seemed to be enjoying its newfound celebrity status, occasionally bleating at its audience. Emily found herself drawn into Ryan's enthusiasm. But how would we even begin to organize this? She asked, her natural inclination towards structure and planning asserting itself. We can't just improvise a whole presentation. Why not? Ryan countered. He pulled out his tablet and began typing rapidly. Look, we've got the perfect setup. We can document how different people react to unexpected changes, gather data on problem-solving approaches, and maybe even research why the goat chose our classroom in the first place. As they talked, other students began gravitating toward them, drawn by Ryan's animated gesturing and Emily's focused expression. Sarah Chun, the class president, joined their impromptu planning session. I heard you guys talking about turning this into a project, she said. Count me in. I've got some experience with animals from volunteering at the shelter. The energy in the room began to shift. What had started as chaos was transforming into something more organized, more purposeful. Students who had been hiding on top of their desks now came down, pulled in by the excitement of creating something unexpected. Emily found herself opening a new document on her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she began organizing their thoughts. We need to break this down into manageable sections, she said, her confidence growing. Research, documentation, presentation structure. Ryan grinned, watching as their classmates began forming groups based on Emily's organizational framework. Some students started researching goat behavior on their phones, while others worked on capturing video footage of their unusual visitor. Even the class clown, Mike Peterson, had stopped making jokes and was helping to create a safe space for the goat to move around without damaging more school property. The goat, as if sensing its new role as an educational tool, had settled down near the front of the classroom, occasionally nibbling on dropped papers and watching the students with curious eyes. Mr. Johnson, who had finally gotten off the phone, stood OB, serving his students with a mix of bewilderment and growing appreciation. What had started as Ryan's impulsive suggestion was rapidly evolving into something bigger than anyone had anticipated. The classroom had become a hub of spontaneous collaboration, with students who normally barely spoke to each other now working together toward a common goal. As Emily looked around at her energized classmates, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't the carefully controlled environment she was used to, but somehow it felt right. The rigid boundaries she'd always relied on were dissolving, replaced by something more dynamic and exciting. What none of them realized yet was that this impromptu project would lead to discoveries about themselves and each other that went far beyond their biology curriculum. The classroom had transformed into an impromptu command center. Emily, surprising herself and others, stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand, delegating tasks with newfound authority. The usual classroom hierarchy had dissolved, replaced by a dynamic system based on each student's natural abilities and interests. We need 3 main groups, Emily announced, her voice stronger than usual. She drew a quick diagram on the board, her normally perfect handwriting slightly rushed but still legible. Research team, documentation team, and goat management team. She paused, looking directly at her classmates. Who's good at what? Ryan had positioned himself near the goat, already pulling granola bars from his perpetually stuffed backpack. I've got animal duty, he called out, carefully unwrapping a bar. My aunt runs a petting zoo. I've dealt with goats before. The goat's ears perked up at the sound of crinkling wrapper, and it trotted over to Ryan, butting his leg gently. The class naturally began to sort itself. Sarah Chun, known for her perfect grade in AP Biology, took charge of the research team. She commandeered 3 computers and set up a shared document. Focus on goat behavior, adaptability in animals, and stress responses in confined spaces. She directed her group, which included the school's science club members. Meanwhile, the documentation team, led by Marcus Wong and his ever-present camera, spread out around the room. We need multiple angles, he instructed, his usual shyness forgotten in the excitement of the moment. Jenny, can you get shots of the group dynamics? Alex, focus on the goats' interactions. Mr. Johnson, who had initially stepped back to observe, found himself drawn into the students' enthusiasm. You know, he said, approaching Emily's whiteboard, this could tie in perfectly with our unit on behavioral adaptation. He began adding notes to the corner of the board, expanding on their impromptu curriculum. As the groups worked, students began sharing personal stories about unexpected changes in their lives. Lisa Martinez told about how her family's sudden move from Chicago had forced her to adapt to a new school culture. I thought it would be terrible, she admitted, but I ended up discovering talents I never knew I had. The goat, now nicknamed Darwin by the class, had settled into a routine of wandering between groups, accepting treats, and occasionally head-butting chairs out of its way. Ryan stayed close, observing its behavior and taking notes on his phone. Look at how it's adapting to us, he pointed out. It's already learned who's most likely to have food. Emily found herself moving between groups, her natural organizational skills flourishing in the unconventional situation. She noticed how students who usually stayed silent in class were now actively participating, offering insights and suggestions. Even Mike Peterson, who typically spent classes making paper airplanes, was engaged in researching goat behavior patterns. Mr. Johnson watched his normally structured classroom function in this new, organic way. The standard curriculum had been temporarily abandoned, but learning was happening. On multiple levels. Students were applying scientific principles, practicing documentation skills, and most importantly, working together in ways they never had before. You know what's really interesting? Sarah called out from her research station. Goats are actually highly social animals. They form complex hierarchies and can recognize facial expressions in humans. This information sparked a new round of observations and note-taking among the groups. As the morning progressed, the initial chaos had evolved into a coordinated effort. Students who had never worked together were now collaborating effectively, each contributing their unique strengths to the project. The fear and panic that had initially gripped the classroom had been replaced by purposeful energy and genuine curiosity. What started as a disruption was becoming a lesson in itself, though none of them yet realized just how significant this morning would prove to be in their understanding of adaptation, both in nature and in their own lives. The real surprise was still to come, but for now, they were fully immersed in their unconventional learning experience. The classroom had transformed into an impromptu auditorium. Desks were arranged in a semicircle, with a clear space at the front where Emily and Ryan stood beside Darwin the goat. The documentation team had set up their phones and tablets to record the presentation from multiple angles, while Sarah's research group had their findings displayed on the classroom's projector screen. So, what we're witnessing today, Emily began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, is a real-time example of behavioral adaptation. She gestured to Darwin, who was contentedly munching on Ryan's last granola bar. Our unexpected visitor has demonstrated remarkable adaptability in an unfamiliar environment. Ryan stepped forward, his usual joking demeanor tempered by genuine enthusiasm. Look at how Darwin's behavior has changed in just 2 hours, he said, pointing to the time-lapse video Marcus had compiled. When he first arrived, he was agitated and disruptive. Now he's comfortable enough to interact with us in structured ways. The video showed Darwin's progression from chaos-causing intruder to willing participant in their impromptu study. The class watched as the footage captured their own transformation from panic to organized engagement. But this isn't just about Darwin, Emily continued, growing more confident with each word. What we've witnessed is a multi-species adaptation event. Both the goat and the humans in this room have modified their behaviors to accommodate each other. James Rodriguez, typically quiet in class, raised his hand. Something similar happened when my family's house flooded last year, he shared, his voice carrying across the now silent room. We had to adapt quickly, and at first it seemed impossible. But then, like today, we found ways to make it work. His story sparked a chain reaction. Other students began sharing their own experiences with unexpected changes. Each story added layers to their understanding of adaptation as more than just a biological concept. Check this out, Alex called from the back, pulling up a graph on the projector. We mapped Darwin's stress behaviors against the class's organization level. There's a clear inverse correlation. The more organized we became, the calmer he got. Sarah jumped in with her research findings. This mirrors studies done on other social animals, she explained, clicking through her slides. Goats, like humans, seek stability in their social environment. When we provided that stability, Darwin responded positively. The presentation continued to evolve organically, with students building on each other's observations. Ryan demonstrated how Darwin had learned to respond to simple hand signals, while the documentation team showed footage of the class's transformation from chaos to coordination. Mr. Johnson, watching from his desk, found himself taking notes. In his 20 years of teaching, he'd never seen his students so thoroughly engage with a concept. They weren't just reciting facts, they were living the scientific process. But here's what's really interesting, Emily said, pointing to a timeline they'd created. Look at how quickly we adapted. Within minutes of Ryan's suggestion, we went from panic to purpose. The human brain's capacity for rapid problem-solving is remarkable. Darwin, as if on cue, wandered to the front of the room and stood beside Emily. The class laughed as he gently headbutted her leg, seeking attention. Ryan reached over to scratch behind the goat's ears, demonstrating the trust they'd built. In conclusion, Ryan said, grinning at his classmates, I think we can safely say that today's lesson went way beyond what any of us expected. We've learned that adaptation isn't just something that happens over millions of years. It's happening right now in this room. The presentation continued with more students contributing their observations and insights. What had started as a chaotic interruption had become a comprehensive study of adaptation, behavior, and social dynamics. But even as they celebrated their successful transformation of crisis into opportunity, none of them suspected the surprising revelation that would soon add another layer to their understanding of adaptation. Mr. Johnson glanced at the clock, knowing that what would happen next would change everything. But for now, he let his students continue their remarkable demonstration of learning in action. The presentation had created a momentum of its own. As Emily stood before her classmates, she felt a shift in her usual reserved demeanor. The carefully constructed walls she'd built around herself over years of academic focus began to crack. I want to share something personal, Emily said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. For years, I've adapted to high school by becoming invisible. I took perfect notes, got perfect grades, and never raised my hand unless I was completely certain of the answer. She paused, looking at Darwin, who was now sitting contentedly beside Ryan. But today showed me that sometimes the best adaptations happen when you let go of control. The classroom fell silent. Students who had known Emily for years but had never heard her speak about herself leaned forward, engaged by this unexpected revelation. When Darwin burst through that door, she continued, my first instinct was to freeze, to wait for someone else to take charge. But thanks to Ryan's crazy idea, she smiled at her friend, I found myself doing something completely different. And you know what? It worked better than any carefully planned presentation I've ever given. Ryan, sensing the importance of the moment, managed to contain his usual jokes. Instead, he added, sometimes the best adaptations come from the most unexpected places. He turned to the class with a grin. I mean, who would have thought that Emily Matthews would end up leading a spontaneous goat-based research project? The laughter that followed was warm and inclusive, not mocking. Other students began sharing their own experiences of breaking out of their comfort zones during the morning's events. I always thought I was just the class photographer, Marcus admitted, holding up his camera. But today, I found myself organizing people, directing shots, helping tell our story. Maybe I've been limiting myself? Jenny Chun, captain of the debate team, spoke up. Speaking of limiting ourselves, did you notice how all our usual social groups disappeared today? The athletes worked with the science club. The drama kids collaborated with the math team. It's like Darwin here broke down all our artificial barriers. Ryan, in a moment of inspired comedy, stood beside Mr. Johnson's desk and adopted the teacher's characteristic pose. "Remember, class," he said in a passable imitation, "adaptation isn't just about survival of the fittest. It's about survival of the most flexible." He paused dramatically, causing even Mr. Johnson to chuckle. And sometimes that flexibility means letting a goat be your teaching assistant. The room erupted in laughter again, but this time it was tinged with recognition. They had all shown remarkable flexibility today, adapting not just to the presence of an unexpected animal, but to new roles and relationships with each other. Emily looked around the room, seeing her classmates in a new light. The labels they'd all worn so comfortably, nerd, jock, class clown, wallflower, seemed less relevant now. They had become something else, a team, researchers, problem solvers. "I think," she said, her voice growing stronger, "we've learned more about adaptation today than we could have from any textbook. We've seen it in Darwin, in ourselves, and in how we work together." The energy in the room was electric, a sense of shared accomplishment and discovery hanging in the air. But as the students celebrated their successful transformation of chaos into learning, none of them realized that the morning's biggest revelation was yet to come. Mr. Johnson checked his watch, knowing that the next few minutes would add an unexpected dimension to everything they thought they'd learned. The real lesson about adaptation was about to unfold, and it would challenge their assumptions in ways they couldn't imagine. The knock on the classroom door would change everything. But for now, the students continued sharing their insights, unaware that their understanding of adaptation was about to evolve yet again. As the shared reflection moment wound down, the practical matter of Darwin's presence needed addressing. The goat, who had been remarkably well-behaved during the presentations, was now showing signs of restlessness, pawing at the classroom floor. "We should probably figure out what to do with our guest lecturer," Mr. Johnson said, checking his phone. "The administration will be sending someone soon." Tom Chun, the school's track team captain, stepped forward. "I think I can help with this. We used to have goats at my grandparents' farm." He approached Darwin slowly, hands open and relaxed. The goat regarded him with interest, ears perked forward. The class watched as Tom demonstrated a gentle but firm approach to handling the animal. "The key is to make them feel secure," he explained, carefully placing his hand on Darwin's back. "They're prey animals, so they need to trust you." Emily, still standing at the front of the room, began documenting Tom's technique. "This is another perfect example of adaptive behavior," she noted. "Tom's applying previous experience to a new situation, and Darwin's responding to familiar handling cues." The class gathered around, maintaining a respectful distance as Tom successfully secured a makeshift lead around Darwin's neck using a jump rope from the gym bag. The goat followed him willingly, seemingly calm under his confident handling. "You know," Sarah said, consulting her research notes, "this whole experience really demonstrates how adaptability isn't just about survival. It's about finding opportunities in challenges." She gestured around the transformed classroom. "Look at what we've accomplished in just one morning." Mr. Johnson nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Which is why I have a proposition for the class." He moved to the whiteboard, erasing their earlier notes to create a clean space. "How would you all feel about turning this experience into your final project for the semester?" The suggestion was met with immediate enthusiasm. Students began calling out ideas, building on their morning's work. "We could create a comprehensive study of rapid adaptation in both animals and humans," Emily suggested, her academic mind already organizing the possibilities. "And include all the video documentation we gathered," Marcus added, waving his camera. "We've got some ING footage of how everyone's behavior changed over time." Ryan, who had been unusually quiet for the past few minutes, spoke up. "But maybe the most important part isn't just what we learned about adaptation." He looked around at his classmates. "Maybe it's about how we adapted together." The sentiment resonated through the room. Students who rarely spoke to each other were now standing in mixed groups, energetically discussing project possibilities. The usual social barriers had dissolved, replaced by a shared sense of accomplishment and purpose. Mr. Johnson watched his students with satisfaction, knowing that the morning's events had taught them more than any planned lesson could have. But he also knew something they didn't, something that would add an entirely new dimension to their understanding of adaptation. As Darwin stood calmly beside Tom, occasionally accepting gentle pats from nearby students, the atmosphere in the classroom was one of completion and achievement. They had successfully handled an unexpected situation, learned valuable lessons about adaptation, and grown closer as a class. But just as they thought they had everything figured out, a knock at the door signaled the arrival of information that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the morning's events. Mr. Johnson moved to answer it, aware that the real lesson was about to begin. The students, still caught up in their planning and celebrations, didn't notice the slight smile on their teacher's face as he reached for the door handle. They were about to learn that adaptation sometimes means completely rewriting your understanding of a situation. The final bell rang, but unlike most days, no one rushed to leave. Emily and Ryan lingered near Mr. Johnson's desk, still buzzing with energy from the morning's events. Darwin had been temporarily settled in the school's fenced courtyard, supervised by Tom and the administrative staff. "I still can't believe how everything came together," Emily said, organizing her notes from the day. Her usually pristine notebook was filled with hastily scribbled observations and diagrams, a physical representation of how she'd adapted her typically rigid study methods. Ryan pulled out his phone, scrolling through the videos he'd captured. "Look at this," he said, holding up the screen. The footage showed the exact moment when the class transformed from chaos to coordination. "We should definitely edit this into a documentary. The whole school needs to see this." The transformation wasn't just in the classroom, Emily noted, watching the video. "Look at how everyone changed." She pointed to specific moments. Marcus directing people with newfound confidence, Sarah sharing her research expertise without her usual competitiveness, even Mike Peterson actively contributing instead of disrupting. The hallway outside began to fill with the usual after-school noise, but the energy inside the classroom remained focused. Several students had stayed behind, gathering around Emily and Ryan to share their thoughts about documenting the experience. "We could create a series of short videos," Jenny suggested, her debate team organizational skills emerging. One about the initial chaos, another about the adaptation process, and a final one about the results. "And we should include interviews," Marcus added, still clutching his camera. "Everyone experienced this differently. That's valuable data for understanding group adaptation." Ryan leaned against a desk, his usual playful demeanor tempered by genuine enthusiasm. "You know what's really cool?" he said, looking at Emily. "This morning, you could barely look anyone in the eye during presentations. Now look at you. You're practically running the show." Emily felt her cheeks flush, but for once, she didn't try to deflect the attention. "I guess sometimes you need a goat to crash your classroom to figure out who you really are," she said, surprising herself with the joke. The small group laughed, but their amusement was interrupted by movement at the classroom door. A tall figure stood in the doorway, casting a shadow across the floor. The students turned, expecting to see the principal or perhaps the animal control officer they'd been told was coming. Instead, they saw someone they didn't recognize, someone whose presence would completely change their understanding of the day's events. Mr. Johnson, who had been quietly grading papers at his desk, looked up with that same mysterious smile he'd been wearing earlier. He seemed to have been waiting for this moment. "I think," he said, standing up, "you're about to learn one final lesson about adaptation." The students exchanged confused looks. They thought the excitement was over, that they'd learned all they could from their unexpected morning visitor. But something in Mr. Johnson's tone suggested otherwise. Emily noticed Ryan straightening up, his usual relaxed posture becoming more alert. The atmosphere in the room shifted, the celebratory mood giving way to curious anticipation. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, and as the fluorescent lights illuminated their face, the real story behind Darwin's classroom invasion was about to unfold. A story that would make them reconsider everything they thought they'd learned about adaptation. The late afternoon sun slanted through the classroom windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Emily stood with Ryan near the science club's bulletin board, pinning up some of their photos from the morning's events. Her hands moved with newfound confidence as she arranged the documentation of their unusual day. "You know," Emily said, stepping back to examine their impromptu display, "I've been thinking about joining the science club." She smoothed down a curling corner of one of the photos. "I always wanted to, but I was afraid I wouldn't fit in." Ryan paused in his task of organizing the digital files on his tablet. "Seriously? You?" The girl who just orchestrated an entire class into turning chaos into a scientific study. He shook his head with a grin. After today, I think you could run the science club." "It's different now," Emily admitted, adjusting her glasses. "Today showed me that science isn't just about memorizing facts and following procedures. It's about being able to adapt and observe and," she gestured to the photos, "work with people." The images on the bulletin board told the story of their morning. Students who normally sat alone were shown working in groups. The class clown was captured deep in research, and even Emily herself appeared in several shots, confidently directing their impromptu study. As they worked, Lisa Martinez approached them hesitantly. Emily noticed her red-rimmed eyes and slightly slumped shoulders. "Everything okay?" she asked, surprising herself with how naturally the concern came. Lisa paused, twisting the strap of her backpack. "I had to leave early for a dentist appointment. I missed most of the presentation, and everyone's talking about how amazing it was. I feel like I missed out on something important." Before the events of this morning, Emily would have merely nodded sympathetically and returned to her task. Instead, she found herself reaching for her notebook. "Actually, we're putting together a video project about everything that happened. We could really use someone with fresh eyes to help us organize the footage." Ryan picked up on Emily's initiative immediately. "Yeah, and you're in media studies, right? Your perspective would be perfect for this." Lisa's face brightened visibly. "Really? You guys don't want my help?" "Of course," Emily said firmly, already pulling out her color-coded planning sheets. "We could meet tomorrow during lunch to start going through everything." As they began discussing plans for the video project, more students drifted over, drawn by their enthusiasm. The science club bulletin board was becoming an impromptu planning center for what was clearly evolving into something bigger than just documenting one unusual morning. Mr. Johnson observed this growing collaboration from his desk, that knowing smile still playing at the corners of his mouth. He checked his watch again, then looked toward the doorway as if expecting someone. Emily noticed his glance and felt a flutter of curiosity. Throughout the day, their teacher had maintained an air of someone who knew more than he was sharing. She'd been too caught up in the excitement to question it before, but now, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Heavy boots, coming closer. The conversation around the bulletin board died down as everyone turned toward the door. Ryan moved to stand beside Emily, his usual jovial expression replaced by one of intense interest. "Why do I get the feeling," he whispered, "that Darwin's story isn't over yet?" Emily nodded slowly, her mind already racing with new questions. The day had taught her to embrace unexpected changes, but something told her that the biggest adaptation was yet to come. The footsteps stopped just outside the classroom door. Through the narrow window, Emily could see a shadow, and for a moment, time seemed to suspend itself. Whatever was about to happen would add yet another layer to their understanding of adaptation, and perhaps reveal why Mr. Johnson had maintained that mysterious smile all day. The classroom door opened slowly, revealing a weather-worn man in his 50s, dressed in work clothes and muddy boots. His presence brought with it an air of purpose that immediately captured everyone's attention. Behind him, Darwin's distinct bleating could be heard from the courtyard. "Mr. Wallace," Mr. Johnson said, standing up from his desk. There was something in the way he greeted the visitor that suggested this wasn't their first meeting. Emily and Ryan exchanged glances. The name seemed to carry some significance, though they couldn't quite place why. The rest of the students gathered closer, instinctively sensing that something important was about to unfold. "So," Mr. Wallace said, his eyes scanning the classroom with what appeared to be nostalgic recognition, "I hear my Billy caused quite a stir this morning." His weathered face broke into a gentle smile. "Though I suppose you've been calling him Darwin." "You're Billy?" several students asked in unison. "Yes," he replied, moving further into the room. "He's part of our traveling educational program. We visit schools to teach students about agriculture and adaptation." He paused, looking directly at Mr. Johnson. Though today's visit wasn't exactly scheduled, the pieces started falling into place in Emily's mind. "You mean, this wasn't just a random goat invasion?" she asked, her analytical brain already reviewing the day's events in a new light. Mr. Wallace leaned against a desk, the same desk Emily noticed that he seemed to gravitate toward naturally. "I graduated from this school 30 years ago," he revealed. "Sat right here in Mr. Peterson's biology class." He nodded toward where Mr. Johnson now stood, though the classroom's changed quite a bit since then. Ryan's eyes widened. "Wait, you were a student here? And now you're an educator yourself?" "Life has a way of surprising you," Mr. Wallace said. "Back then, I was struggling in school. Couldn't focus, couldn't sit still. Until one day, something unexpected happened that changed everything for me." The students leaned in, captivated. Emily found herself pulling out her notebook again, but this time not out of habit. She genuinely wanted to capture every detail of this new development. "You see, Billy isn't just any goat," Mr. Wallace continued. "He's specially trained to help teach students about adaptation, problem-solving, and working together. We visit schools all over the state." He glanced at Mr. Johnson, usually with proper scheduling and preparation. Sarah, who had been quietly processing this information, spoke up. "So, when you say he's trained, everything that happened today," Mr. Wallace's eyes twinkled. "Billy knows how to create controlled chaos. He's trained to respond to certain cues, to interact safely with students, and to demonstrate various behaviors that teach about adaptation. Though I must say," he added with a chuckle, "from what I've heard, you all adapted to his presence remarkably well." The room buzzed with this new information. Everything they'd observed, documented, and learned throughout the day suddenly had an additional layer of meaning. Their study of adaptation had itself been part of a carefully crafted learning experience. Emily felt her mind racing with questions, but before she could voice any of them, Mr. Wallace pulled out an old, worn photograph from his jacket pocket. "This might interest you," he said, holding it up. The students crowded around to see a faded image of a classroom. Their classroom, decades earlier. In it, a young man who was clearly Mr. Wallace stood next to a goat, surrounded by his classmates. "You see," he said, his voice soft with memory, "sometimes the best lessons about adaptation come from unexpected teachers. For me, it was a goat named Einstein who visited our class when I was struggling to find my path. Today, Billy helps me pass that lesson on to others." The revelation hung in the air, but something told Emily that there was still more to come. Mr. Wallace hadn't just come to retrieve his goat. He had something else to share, something that would connect their morning's adventure to a larger story they were just beginning to understand. The afternoon light was fading when Mr. Wallace led the group out to the courtyard where Darwin, or Billy, as they now knew him, waited patiently. The goat perked up at the sight of his owner, but remained remarkably composed, nothing like the chaos-causing creature that had burst into their classroom that morning. "Would you like to see what Billy can really do?" Mr. Wallace asked, pulling some small objects from his pocket. The students gathered around eagerly as he placed several colored blocks on the ground. What happened next left them speechless. Billy methodically sorted the blocks by color, then by size, demonstrating a level of intelligence and training none of them had suspected. He can solve simple puzzles, demonstrate basic mathematical concepts, and even mirror human emotional responses, Mr. Wallace explained. All skills we use to teach students about different types of intelligence and adaptation. Emily's pen flew across her notebook. "So, when he was responding to our organizational efforts this morning, he was actually following his training," Mr. Wallace confirmed. "Though I must say, your class's response was extraordinary. Most groups take much longer to move from chaos to cooperation." Ryan laughed suddenly. "Wait a minute," he said, turning to Mr. Johnson. "You knew about this all along, didn't you?" Their teacher smiled. "Mr. Wallace and I had arranged for a demonstration next week," he admitted. "But when Billy escaped from his trailer this morning and made his way here, He shrugged. Sometimes the best lessons are the ones we don't plan. But why not tell us? Several students asked simultaneously. Mr. Wallace stepped forward. Because real adaptation doesn't come from following instructions, he explained. It comes from facing unexpected challenges and finding your own solutions. He gestured to their group. Look at what you accomplished today when you thought you were dealing with a random event. Emily looked around at her classmates, seeing them in yet another new light. We didn't just study adaptation, she realized. We were part of an adaptation experiment ourselves. And that's not all, Mr. Wallace said, reaching into his bag. He pulled out a flyer for an upcoming regional science fair. I'm here to invite your class to present your experience at next month's Innovation in Education Showcase. Your spontaneous response to Billy's visit created exactly the kind of learning moment we try to facilitate. The excitement was immediate. Students who had never considered participating in a science fair were suddenly buzzing with ideas. Even Emily, who had always shied away from public speaking, found herself eager to share their story. The showcase includes educators and students from across the state, Mr. Wallace continued. We'd like you to demonstrate how unexpected challenges can become powerful learning opportunities. He smiled at Billy, who was now contentedly sitting beside him. And of course, Billy would be there to help. As the students excitedly discussed this new opportunity, Mr. Wallace pulled Emily aside. You remind me of someone, he said quietly. 30 years ago, there was a shy student in this very classroom who found her voice when Einstein, Billy's predecessor, visited. She went on to become one of the leading researchers in educational psychology. Who was she? Emily asked. Mr. Wallace's eyes twinkled. Why don't you ask your mother about her high school biology class sometime? The revelation hit Emily like a thunderbolt. Her mother, Dr. Sarah Matthews, whose research she had read but never fully understood until now. The papers about experiential learning and adaptive education suddenly made perfect sense. As the sun set over the school, casting long shadows across the courtyard, the students began to disperse, but not in their usual isolated groups. They left in clusters, excitedly planning their showcase presentation, sharing contact information, and breaking down the social barriers that had seemed so insurmountable just that morning. Emily and Ryan were the last to leave, walking beside Mr. Wallace as he led Billy to his trailer. You know what the best part about adaptation is? Mr. Wallace said, pausing at the school gate. It never really ends. Each change leads to new opportunities, new connections, new understandings. Just like today, as they watched the trailer drive away, Emily realized that their study of adaptation hadn't just been about biological concepts or classroom dynamics. It had been about breaking free from self-imposed limitations, about finding strength in unexpected places, and about the continuing cycle of learning and growth that connects one generation to the next. The goat that crashed their biology class had taught them more than any textbook could, and their real journey of adaptation was just beginning.